must say I am here illegally, because in half an hour time the plenary session in Brussels will start, and I'll be absent against the rules, but I'm happy to share with you for some hours before returning. That was an interesting quotation from this Wikipedia. I am not very happy about it. Establishing a Congress of Estonia which competed with the official Supreme Soviet. The problem was that we were occupied illegally for 50 years. So the occupation mock parliaments were not actually legal. And we were opposing these illegal structures of the occupiers by creating, by National Citizens Initiative, a transition time parliament which was based upon legal Estonian citizens. But that's one correction. I happened to read yesterday a passage from John, the 6th chapter, where Jesus says, "It is a spirit that quickens. The flesh profits nothing." It's very hard for us to understand this because we feel we are flesh, basically. And we are following the demands of flesh or material development. But Jesus continues, "The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. I am the living bread which has come down from heaven. If any man eat this bread, he shall not die, he shall live forever." And in Europe we are dealing with our daily bread all the time, fighting to have better bread, better quality bread. And that's the eternal question. I remember when I was in the Soviet Union, I tried to find something positive in the European Union, because the official Soviet propaganda told us that European Union is a result of big imperialist groups which try to control the population, to exploit them, and it's bound to fail because divisions between imperialist groups are insurmountable. So the European Union will be doomed. Instead, it turned out that the Soviet Union was doomed. Nobody believed 21 years ago that the Soviet Union would fail or disintegrate. People were aware of its deep crisis, but everybody thought that it's bound to continue in foreseeable future. But such things happen. So it gives us hope. And I think this is very important. But speaking about the crisis, I think it's useful to return more than 70 years ago to the period of post-World War II. The crisis of that time was a real crisis, and it makes maybe our life a bit easier, because the present crisis is not that serious at all. But still, you needed, as on occasion of every crisis, you needed an unorthodox solution. And this was proposed 62 years ago by Robert Schuman. I think what Schuman proposed was actually the unity of spirit and bread, because I was very much astonished when I found in one of Schumann's speeches from 1950 or so a passage where he declares democracy is either Christian or it is non-existent, because a non-Christian democracy can lead only to tyranny or anarchy. You can't believe that these words could be uttered today, so many years later. It seems like something crazy. But the founding father of the European unity was convinced in this, and I think this is a challenge for us to come to an understanding what went wrong. Because the founding fathers of the European Union were practicing Christians, practically all of them. What happened in between? And what forced many years later to start to look for the soul of Europe? In 1988, Pope John Paul II appeared before the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And he told that another sign of times is that Europe is in search of her soul, is in need of inspiration to secure her spiritual cohesion. We have been used to speak about cohesion funds, but what we need is a spiritual cohesion fund. And Jeff mentioned the speech of Delors 20 years ago. It was just after Maastricht was signed. So the Europe entered a new stage of development, a political stage. And Delors said, we have reached a stage where the debate on the meaning and direction of European construction has become a decisive political factor. If during the next 10 years we won't succeed in providing Europe with a soul, a spirituality, a significance, we should consider this game to be lost. And Delors concluded that the immense potential of Maastricht can't be used fully if there's no spirituality, no understanding of the spiritual meaning of Europe. I was happy to be member of the Convention of the Future of Europe 10 years ago. It was a very democratic approach, and its motivation was to address the credibility gap between European institutions and millions of citizens. And because of this, it was designed as a very democratic approach. Also, the candidate states were invited on equal footing. 2 members from each national parliament. I was one from Estonian parliament. 1 member from each national government, the delegation from the European Parliament, and so on. So we reached the draft of the constitutional treaty. And then there was an unexpected obstacle. There was no problem of mentioning in the introduction, not in the legal text, but just in the introduction about the European roots, classical roots of enlightenment. But it became a big, huge problem to mention European Christian roots, which from where democracy originates. And it proved to be insurmountable. I have a personal feeling, it's not obliging, it's my personal feeling, having experienced all this, that this was a moment when it became clear that this initiative will not succeed because it would not have blessing of God. And what resulted was the refusal by French and Dutch voters, and what resulted was a period of reflection. It was like Israeli people would have sent back from the promised land to start a new round of their trip in desert. But so we are here. And my last quotation, which has impressed me very much, comes from now the successor, the John Paul II. He wrote, Cardinal Ratzinger wrote in 2004 an article which was titled Europa ist krank, Europe is sick. And I think this diagnosis is valid even more today, 8 years later. And I think this is very important, just to try to understand what happened to Europe in the meantime. Because Europe was supposed, and representatives of other religions still view Europe as a Christian continent. Even whatever we do, wrong or right, we are being seen as Christians and bear responsibility as Christians for this. But Ratzinger leads attention to the fact that suddenly European culture, European identity has lost its substance, that Europe, at the peak of its technical and material development, has become hollow. There's no substance in it because the technological and commercial culture, civilization, which Europe has spread all around the world, can't be identified with Europe as we have known it. And he mentions also, as many people have mentioned, that the common denominator of this crisis can be called secularism. Secularism and dictatorship of relativism. That is losing immutable, eternal values and truths. Now, I think one conclusion which has been made very often, I've listened to these debates in the European Parliament, and today Barroso and Van Rompuy will appear before the Parliament and are trying to explain the situation as it stands. Economic and financial crisis didn't appear sudden. This crisis has moral roots. It started as a crisis of values, our basic values, and then it emerged later on as economic and debt crisis. But this has been prepared for decades. Last year I was speaker at the German Pan-European Convention, and I discovered an article by my predecessor in the European Parliament, Otto von Habsburg, who, it was written in 1984, and he writes that during my generation, we used to spend as much as we earned and put something aside for black days. Now, and he means 1980s, people have used to spend more than they earn and take loans, which means that they have started to live at the expense of their children. And what really struck me was that in quarter of century, nothing has been changed. Such warnings have not been heeded, and the result is that now we have used to live at the expense of our grandchildren, whose numbers are diminishing. So there will be not enough grandchildren to pay our loans. And the other fact, which is there, in which we didn't believe, is that really loans have to be paid. You can just cancel some of Greece's loans, but you can't do it with all loans over the world. And this comes back. It is very interesting. This material things, money, production, they appear to be intimately related to soft values, such as trust and credibility. Because what we see today is that the buildings are there, productivity is there, labor force is there, only that's a question of trust. Because you can't meet your commitments in time, as you have promised. And we have been living in the faith, self-styled faith that you can go on for years and years living at the expense of future. And now the moment of truth has come. The situation has changed. There will be clearly no return to the previous style of living. One myth also has been destroyed, that states are too big to fail. I remember as the chairman of my political group, European People's Party group, Joseph Daul, was really impressed when Latvia became broke 3 years ago. Now Greece has become broke. We can use more decent political titles, but the fact is there. But there's also a way out, namely my colleague, the leader of Latvian delegation, Dombrovskis, was a very good financial expert, was called to take the post of the Prime Minister. Nobody wanted this post that time. And amazingly, he didn't have any personal interests in gain, as usual. He still continues to live in a Soviet-built apartment, not a private house or villa. But what he did, he managed to cut expenditure by 17%. It was as simple as that. And what is the result? Today, Latvia has restored the main thing, its credibility. It has managed to balance the budget, expenditure and earnings. And so, if Latvia would need more credits, there will be no problem of having them, in difference with Greece or Spain, because Latvia has proved that it is capable and willing to address the economic crisis and restore balance. And that is most important message for the financial markets. Credibility has been restored, and so everything is possible. I think this also is a very hopeful message. But growth, we are speaking today about the growth, that instead of diminishing and cutting our expenditure, we need to now stimulate growth. But I think for us it's important also to understand what do we mean under growth. Because for the Western societies often growth has become a must, a rigid, mechanical, limitless process. Is it to be continued forever and ever? Is it quantity versus quality? Do we need such an interpretation of growth? Consumption because of consumption? Considerable part of economic growth is not really needed. Considerable part of it ends in adding to the growth of mountains of waste. And therefore the conclusion is that the present model of progress and welfare state is not sustainable. Problems are structural, not cyclical. The growth before the crisis was distorted, and we have to draw this conclusion. It was distorted in fundamental ways, and we can't expect returning to the status quo as it was before the crisis. So this is a moment we need to draw different conclusions. And what's more, I think during the last decades, 30 or 40 years, what we have been used as, described as Homo sapiens, has suddenly, step by step, became Homo consumens, a consumption person, which means that it's oriented toward consumption, like in ancient Rome, bread and circus, consumption and entertainment. And clearly this can't be the source of happiness, it can't be the source of healthy growth or real satisfaction. This reminds me of a very interesting idea of progress. We have been used to the material understanding of progress, that it starts from the below and proceeds from the higher and higher levels all the time. But it could be also viewed as a cycle, namely the original state was bondage, slavery. Then there was a spiritual faith generated. And if there's a spiritual faith, like it was in Poland in 1980, then from it emerged great courage. You could see it at the end of 1980s, before the Berlin Wall. It didn't fall down. It was taken down. It did not fall automatically. And from great courage, there follows liberty. Now it's all very good, but what next? Liberty usually produces abundance. And now the critical turn will follow. What to do with abundance, with riches, with unlimited consumption? The next critical stage will be selfishness. And if we will be conquered by selfishness, from selfishness the development will be toward complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependency, and from dependency back to bondage. not necessarily physical bondage or political bondage. It could be moral bondage, but we need to realize that nothing is automatically granted. And this has been also the experience of my nation, the three Baltic nations. Yesterday in the European Parliament we had a conference organized by my Latvian colleagues. Occupation after liberation, because we were supposed to be liberated from the Nazi dominance in 1944. But in the West, people didn't understand that one dictatorship, one terrorist regime was substituted for the other. And it's very hard to make a difference. So our experience shows, and 25 years ago, nobody here would believe that three Baltic states would become free. They were understood that they will remain within the Soviet Union. Our experience shows also that everything is possible. Everything is possible. It's possible also to overcome the moral crisis, the economic crisis, but on the other hand, that nothing can be taken for granted. Everything could be lost also if we don't take care and if we don't use our own efforts. So the European situation today is really, I think we can assess it with a Ratzinger's diagnosis: Europe is sick. It is a realistic assessment, and from this basis we have to proceed. And what we need really is non-orthodox approaches, but especially appealing to our spiritual values. Because there have been two anti-utopian famous books written in the Western world. One was Orwell's 1984, the best description of communist totalitarian regime by a Western author. But much earlier, Aldous Huxley wrote his book, The Brave New World, at the beginning of 1930s. And I think this is a very, very gloomy option, cutting ties with history, with historic memory, and relying just upon technical progress and well-being, which makes people spiritual slaves. But as I said, crisis is an opportunity. But it needs to realize the importance of soft values and eternal truth. Because truths can't be invented. They can be only presented in a more modern, more understandable language. But like God is one, the truth is one. The truth about human behavior, human nature. Only false gods and half-truths can be multiplied by millions. And the call for reconsideration of the role of church in modern society, which has been pushed on the niche, to the niche role, is something we need to revive. The slogans many years ago, before the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, were "Don't be afraid." And I think our call today also should be, let's not be afraid of materialism. We have immense potential, immense spiritual potential, and the unique tradition, historic tradition of Europe. We should be proud of it, and we should proclaim it in the streets, in the squares, without being ashamed. We have nothing to be ashamed. Thank you.